Thank you for joining NextLabs. Today's subject, we will be talking about entitlement management for Aras Innovator. First thing we're going to talk about is the export license control demo use case summary. So the export license control policy is something that overlays the existing application access control for additional compliance and control measures. The policies, once they are enforced, can restrict certain access of classified data to only users with qualified clearance and based on certain user attributes that are stored within an independent user data source and the application data classifications. It enforces on these three actions, in this case view, edit, and delete, and the policy itself enforces these three data types: part, CAD document, and document itself. The demo setup, we're going to talk about the system architecture. Here we have the Aras server application sitting in the center. We have the outside to the left applications that would be accessing the Aras Innovator via SOAP XML or IOM object. On the far right, we have the control center from NextLabs. This is the policy administration point. Between the Aras Innovator and the control center sits the policy decision point. This is what Aras Innovator will be speaking to in order to gain access to what the individuals will be able to have access as far as information when they have a query come in. There's an IDP of user attributes that's defined, data classification, and policy enforcement. Within the policies themselves that are created within Control Center, in this case both for ITAR and ECL. That policy or policies that are created, that bundle is then deployed out to the policy decision point so that when a request comes in from the web client or client app on the left-hand side, the query is then passed off to the policy decision point. It then evaluates and looks at the different user attributes and then sends a response back and either allows or disallows access for that client to the information that they're requesting. Based on that, specific activity is then sent off to the control center and activity reporting can be created against the information that was trying to be accessed on individual or individuals that are accessing specific information. Task 1 is the design of the classification requirement. So in this case, we have the export classification. What type of information are we exporting? Is it ITAR, BAFA, EAR, so on and so forth? And then we also have the export license. What type of license is going to be used within that export of that particular data and classification? So in this case, let's take a look closely at TAA 42 and TAA 125, because those are the two that we're going to be using within the demonstration. Here we have a setup for the user themselves, a user classification. So here we have Lisa Andrews. In this case, she has an export clearance of ITAR, the TAA 125 that I mentioned earlier, as well as Humberto, who also has ITAR, and in this case, as I mentioned, the TAA 42 for the export license. Going on to the Aras Innovator as root, we can then go in and set up what's needed as far as the export clearance themselves for both the clearance and licenses. Here we have the values that we saw earlier that are being set up for the control classifications and the export license codes themselves. In this case, we want to set up a specific name for, in this case, the effective date. When is this going to be allowed or not allowed, or when will you be able to see the information? So these are all the different types of fields that can be set up in properties within here for the class structure itself. Here we have an item type of CAD, right? The properties, in this case, the export classification that's going to be used, and also the license code itself. Here we go in and look at it at adding in the export classification fields. In this case, we're going to part. We're going to be looking at an export license in this case. The fields themselves for both of that. In this case, we'll select ITAR, and this is for a gasket part that we can see on the right-hand side, and an export license of TAA 42, which I talked about earlier that we're picking. The develop policy enforcement methods. In this case, within here, we're going to specify whether it's a view, edit, or delete. So in this case, we have a simple setup to pick the type of control. We can retrieve the specific classification that we're looking for. In this case, we're going to go in and see what we're going to be using as far as an operation. In this case, it's the view that shows in this example. And then where it's going to call out. So in this case, it's going to call out to NextLab, to the decision point, to understand if that user has the capability to do a view of the information or content it's looking to gather. That REST call will be sent off to the policy decision point and then return a denier access back. Here we assign policy enforcement methods to server events. So in this particular case, we pick an item number or an item part, what type of server event, and what do we want to do? Do we want to be able to do a delete, view, or edit on this particular method? And what it has the abilities based on that, in this case, the item type of part that you're capable of doing. And assign that particular server event on what you can do with it, based on a view, if it's on after or get, on or before an update, so on and so forth. In this case, we have a test data setup, the classification assignment itself. So for the gasket that I mentioned in the prior screen, here we have the export classification of ITAR and the export license of TAA 42. Here we have an example within here for a hose. In this case, it's going to have an export classification of ITAR and an export license of TAA 125 for this particular CAD document. And then this document itself has a Excel spreadsheet for cost center information listed here as well. Here we have the policy controller or control center in this case with the listing of the policy decision point. That's the one active one you see in the center of the screen. So this can control policies for Aras Innovator, as well as if information is exported off to SharePoint or sent through Exchange. Policies that are created here are globally capable of being used in other areas, not only within Aras itself. Here we can see a simple policy. In this case, we're going to view the operation view and deny unqualified users. So the logic is set up here depending on the type of request, if it's going to be denied, depending on the person's clearance, what they can do as far as an action, view, delete, or edit, and what are the typical or types of controls that are on this. In this case, the classification has to be ITAR. Here's the affected users that's listed, the affected resources, as I mentioned earlier, and the affected operations that I also mentioned as well. And what type of enforcement? Is it going to be an allow or deny based on that? Here we have an operation as well for the export control. In this case, if it's going to be denied based on the fact that if it's an unlicensed user. So in this case, we have an affected resource again, based on the classifications looking for. The affected user is the export clearance. And then there's conditions based on that, if it has a certain export classification, right? Or if there's an export license that could be missing or not correct for what they're trying to export, then that's not going to be allowed. And then the affected operation of what they're trying to do, in this case, view, delete, or edit, as we mentioned before, and the enforcement action, again, being denied. Here we see once that policy is created, it's very easy to go in and then deploy that policy, so updates can be made continually if things change within the organization, so they can be pushed out to those particular decision points. The decision points will check in every so often to see if there's any updates and pull that particular information back. So here we do a deploy. You'll get a deploy message back, the status of what that particular policy is. In this particular state, it's deployed, and now you're ready to go. So here we have a scenario where we're now ready to go into Aras as a user and see what should be taking place based on the information that had been previously set up at the beginning of this demonstration. So here we're logging in as an ITAR user, and in this case it's with license code TAA 42. In this case, he should not have or should only have access to either non-ITAR information or ITAR information that doesn't require a license, or one that has a license code of TAA 42. So in this case, we're logged in as Humberto. He's the particular user in this case. He's looking at a document, and in this case, he's going to see information from ITAR items with a license code TAA 42, as well as ones that are shown here that are ITAR that are not requiring a license as well. Here, Humberto's in here. In this case, we're looking at a part. And in this case, he's going to see that he will not only see TAA 42, but he'll also see ones that have no license required as well on here, as well as ITAR ones that do not have an export license listed as well. And the last one for Humberto would be the CAD document. In this case, he only sees the ITAR ones that have no license key and the ones that don't have an ITAR or export classification at all. There are none in here for TAA 42, so there aren't any that are displayed for him to be able to view in this particular instance for this CAD document. Here we go in and look at the user is logged in this case, again, Humberto as an ITAR user with that particular license code. If we take a look at the particular assembly, it's ITAR classified. If we take a look at the bottom, because this is controlled, in this case, sequence number 10, whatever that document is, he does not have access to that one particular document that's not being listed within that field, because he is not a valid user for that particular information. In this case, we're going to log in as Lisa Andrews. This particular user has a different license code, TAA 125, that we mentioned earlier. Again, the same applies to her. Non-ITAR information, ITAR without a license, and also the ones that have a TAA 125 is what she should be able to see, as opposed to Humberto, who had the TAA 42. So here we go through the document again. Again, she can see ITAR, non-export license required, as well as non-ITAR information as well. For this particular document, as we can see, Lisa Andrews is the one that's logged in. Here we're going to take a look at the part. In this case, she can see the clamp particular component. It's because it's under the export of the TAA 125 license. As we noted from prior, Humberto could not see that particular clamp because he didn't have access to the TAA 125 export license. And she also sees the other ones that have no ITAR export classification, as well as the one that is ITAR without a license. Here we look at the CAD document. Again, we can see the one that's for TAA 125, as well as all the other ones that she has the ability to look at that are either non-ITAR or ITAR without a license. And then in the last scenario, which this screen looks very similar to the one we saw with Humberto, in this case on sequence 10, you can see the hose part. And the reason is, if we look at the far right-hand side, is that this is an assembly of ITAR classified, but in this case, it's got an export license of TAA 125, which Lisa has. So that's why she's able to see all three of these particular document numbers and what they pertain to, because she has the right classification within here to take a look at this information. So in this case, the part is TAA 125, it is controlled, and the user does have access to it. In this case, in the last task here of task 10, we're going to have the root user or the super user for Aras Innovator log in. And this user, even though they're the super user of Aras, they have no ITAR clearance at all. So they shouldn't be able to see any access to any non-ITAR data, even though they're the super user. So here the person goes in as super user or root. They're looking at a document. In this case, the only ones that they see are anything that is non-ITAR listed. That's all they're allowed access to. Here we see no ITAR items listed, in this case for this document, as I mentioned. Here we go in and look at a part. The same thing applies here. There's no ITAR items listed for that particular part, and nothing else is shown except standard documents that anyone can take a look at that doesn't require the ITAR license. And the last is the CAD document. Again, this is all particulars that we can see as far as documents, the names and the types that don't have anything as far as ITAR items that are listed. So they are all hidden from this super user, even though he is the super user for the Aras Innovator. So here we can separate out even the data that's within this particular application, even though their rights are that of a root user. The attributes associated and the license, in this case the classification, doesn't allow them to see the certain information. Here we can see that if this user tries to get in and do an edit on any type of information, they will also get an access denied, because even though they can go in and look at certain information, maybe it's only for view mode. So in this case, they can view it, but they can't delete or edit it in this particular scenario. Here again, we're showing that in this case, the delete, they cannot do the delete. And the dashboard from NextLabs will give you enforcement activity, as I mentioned earlier. So any of those denies or access tries on users' parts will be displayed within these different types of charts. So if we take a look at the one in the center that shows the top 10 denied users in the last 30 days, you'll see Humberto tried to access something 72 times within that 30-day period that he wasn't allowed to view. That concludes our demonstration. Thank you for your time.